there are many, many interesting cases concerning the liberal process. Now, interestingly, utilitarian position, or even the Kantian position, which is basically about motivation, and the liberal tradition, radically different from the Confucian tradition. None of them is interested in the question of human nature. It's interested in the question about human beings as, by definition, moral beings, and not at all interested in the question of, quote, self-cultivation. The UN Declaration of Human Rights could be considered as a clear manifestation of this particular approach, at least to a certain extent. The idea is that one very important feature of the UN Declaration of Human Rights is religious values is not injected in it at all. The word God never appears in the Declaration, so it can be totally generalized. The idea is a civilized government will have to behave in a certain manner. If the civilized government involved in torture, arrest without due process, then it's a violation of human rights. The human community as a whole has the right to criticize. And so to hide the various kinds of activities against human rights and cultural diversity, even sovereignty and so forth, are considered unallowable. And so there are commissions, not only by various nations, but of United Nations to see to it that human rights ideas be preserved. So right now, I think we can say it's perhaps one of the most powerful moral persuasion, I quote it, moral persuasion, even though human rights are not directly dealing with moral. Some people say the spirit of the time. Nobody, even if you decide, government decides to violate all kinds of human rights, or in fact, in practice, violates human rights at the rhetorical level, no government will say, we are not interested in human rights, we're willing to violate human rights. No government can afford to do that. Even this government, no matter authoritarian, despotic, and try to violate, in fact, deliberately, and in fact, in practice, also violate human rights, they still subscribe to the human rights discourse. So many forms of human rights, treaties of human rights have been signed by an overwhelming majority of the people. The country that seems to refuse to sign quite a number of them. You know which country?
Sudan.
Pardon me?
Sudan.
Sudan? No, U.S. It's interesting because U.S. say we are honest. So if we want to sign something, our Congress will have to approve it. And then, since it's very difficult for the Congress to get together to approve some of those human rights because they may interfere with our internal activities and interfere with domestic affairs, because the highest principle in America is national interest. So we're not willing to sign. You know the Kyoto Discourse, or Kyoto Accord. So the idea is that we are actually doing it right. Our record of human rights is not perfect. It's one of the very best. But many of the principles that are signed by all kinds of countries who are willing to violate human rights are not assigned by us, not agreed to by us.
Actually, if you look at the list of Amnesty International reports, one on China, if you get them all, they're like this thick, and the ones on America are like this thick. So there are human rights problems in China. I mean, in
the
America.
United States?
Yes.
Yeah. But of course, the argument is still that the human rights has been used time and time again as a political instrument for discipline some countries. Now, part of the, I mentioned many forms of ethics, like care ethics, virtue ethics, especially role ethics. Role ethics has a specific argument against human rights, against the liberal idea of individual individualism, because there's no question about the fact human rights are very deeply rooted in the idea of the dignity of the individual, therefore individualism. Human rights are inalienable, so we all have these rights. And so it is, normally we look at human rights, we know that it's positive, and we know we should support it, and we know many countries violate it. We know we're obligated to criticize those countries. But the problem has become more complex. Part of the reason is because we're talking about 3 generations of human rights discourse. In the United Nations Human Rights Declaration, all 3 generations of rights are included. So it's one of the most comprehensive and one of the most inspiring documents in the human community. Some people believe you can actually develop a kind of global governance based upon human rights. And there's many, many committed human rights advocates. You can even say their commitment is as strong as a religious commitment. And they are secular humanists, but they really commit to human rights. But there are 3 generations. The first generation we're most familiar with, and it's widely used, especially in advanced Western countries.